The man's lips have cracked so deeply that they have stopped bleeding. That was 3 days ago. Now they are simply a dry, split landscape on his face, a small map of the desert itself. He walks because stopping means dying. The camel beside him is trembling at the knee. In the leather panniers draped across the camel's haunches, wrapped in oiled cloth and packed in straw so old it has turned to dust, there are 48 blocks of salt. Each block weighs roughly 3 kilograms. Together, they represent 11 weeks of walking. They represent 7 dead pack animals, 1 dead man buried in a shallow pit in the Saharan sand, and the complete financial futures of 4 families back in the village of Timbuktu. The man carrying this cargo does not think of it in these terms. He thinks only of water and of the salt and of the price it will fetch in the markets of Jannah. He is walking through what historians would one day call one of the most extraordinary commodity systems in human history, a web of roots and relationships, dangers and negotiations that moved salt from the deep desert to the hungry world beyond it for thousands of years without interruption. A system so complex, so brutal, and so relentlessly human that it shaped the very architecture of civilization. You think of salt as a seasoning, a pinch, a shake, the afterthought you reach for at the dinner table. But for most of human history, salt was survival, salt was money. Salt was the reason cities were built where they were built, the reason wars were fought, the reason men walked across surfaces so inhospitable they seemed designed to kill. This is the story of those men, and those roots, and the terrible arithmetic of what it cost, in blood, in bone, in collapsed lungs and burst livers and bleached skeletons left in the sand, to bring salt from where it existed to where it was desperately needed. This is the price of salt. Before we follow him, let us hold this moment. Let us stay here, in the thin desert light of a morning that is indistinguishable from 10,000 other desert mornings on this route, and think about what we are actually looking at. We're looking at one of the oldest commercial transactions in human history, still operating, still moving the same mineral across the same desert along routes that were already ancient when the Prophet Muhammad was born, still organized around the same fundamental logic, that salt exists where people do not, and people exist where salt does not, and someone has to close that gap. Closing that gap is what this man has done with his life. He did not choose it exactly. He was born into a family of caravanners, began walking the desert routes as a child apprenticed to his father, and simply never stopped. He is perhaps 35 years old. He looks 50. The desert does that. We will not learn his name. The historical record does not keep the names of the men who walk the trans-Saharan salt routes. It keeps the names of the merchants who organized the caravans and the kings who taxed them, and the scholars who wrote about them from the comfortable distance of a well-stocked library and a well-supplied city. The man who actually carried the salt is a shadow, inferred, reconstructed, present in the economic logic of a system that could not have functioned without him, but individually invisible. Let him represent all the others, the thousands of men who walked this route across centuries, the men whose labour built the great trading cities of the Sahel, who financed the empires of Mali and Songhai, who made the wealth of Timbuktu possible, who put the salt in the market and the gold in the merchant's bag. They are the foundation of what we're about to explore. Before we follow the routes, we need to understand the hunger, not the poetic kind, the physiological, non-negotiable, cellular kind. The hunger that has driven human beings to walk into deserts and across mountains and over ice sheets for a mineral that the body cannot manufacture and cannot go without. Sodium chloride, table salt, is essential to almost every metabolic process in the human body. It regulates blood pressure. It enables nerve signals to fire. It contracts muscles, including the heart. Lose too much of it, and you go into hyponatremia, confusion, seizure, coma, death. The body is, in a very literal sense, a saltwater machine, and it leaks. Sweat, urine, tears. The body is constantly shedding the sodium it needs to survive. In a hot climate, doing physical labour, a person can lose 3 to 5 grams of sodium in a single day. In the ancient world, there were very few ways to replace it. Meat contained some, fish contained more. But for the vast populations of inland agricultural civilizations, people who grew grain and raised goats and drew water from rivers, the only reliable source was mineral salt. Salt scraped from the earth, from dried lake beds, from underground deposits left by ancient seas. Salt that had to be found, extracted, processed, and transported, often across enormous distances to populations who would die without it. This is why salt moved the world, not because of flavour, because of life, and because of life, it moved everything else with it. Armies, empires, trade networks, legal systems, religious rituals, and the entire concept of money. The English word salary derives from the Latin salarium, the salt ration given to Roman soldiers. The phrase, worth his salt, comes from the same root. When ancient texts describe a man of value, they often reach for salt as the metaphor. It was the thing everything else was measured against. Archaeologists have dated human salt working to at least 8,000 years ago, with evidence of salt production in Romania's Poiana Slatinei site, suggesting organised salt extraction as early as 6000 BCE. But the real explosion of long-distance salt trade came with the growth of ancient cities, with the rise of populations too large to subsist on local resources, dependent on vast supply networks reaching hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometres. The Egyptians traded salt down the Nile and across the Sinai. The Phoenicians built their famous purple dye industry around the salt they used to preserve fish, and traded both across the Mediterranean. The Greeks understood the relationship between salt and commerce so well that the word for fish sauce, gyros, became the root for the trade networks that carried it. The Chinese developed salt monopolies that financed dynasties. The Aztecs extracted salt from Lake Texcoco and built it into their tribute systems. Everywhere complex human civilization appeared, salt trade appeared with it, and wherever salt trade appeared, so did the brutal logistics of moving it, the routes, the caravans, the risks, the men who walked them, and the men who profited from their walking, the merchants and the guards and the water carriers and the children who drove the pack animals, and the tax collectors who waited at the borders, and the bandits who waited just beyond the border's reach. This is the world we're entering, a world where salt was not a condiment but a currency, where the routes that moved it were not roads but lifelines, where the men who walked those routes were not merchants but something closer to soldiers, fighting not with weapons but with endurance, against terrain and thirst and heat and cold, and the slow, grinding arithmetic of distance. Let us begin with the most famous of all ancient salt routes. Let us begin in Africa. The history of salt is, in many ways, the history of the human body's relationship to its environment, the long story of a biological need that geography consistently frustrated. In the tropics, salt deficiency was a constant danger for agricultural populations. In the Arctic, where a diet of fatty animal protein naturally supplied sufficient sodium, it was less acute. But for the great agricultural civilizations of the temperate and subtropical zones, the people of the Nile Valley, the Yellow River Basin, the Indus, the Tigris and Euphrates. Salt was a chronic shortage that had to be managed through trade. The earliest salt trade was local and small-scale, a coastal community exchanging sea salt with an inland community that had something the coast needed. These exchanges were, in a sense, the primitive template from which all subsequent trade would develop. The logic of comparative advantage, you have something I need, I have something you need, let us exchange, was demonstrated with particular clarity by salt, because the need was absolute and the supply was geographically constrained in ways that were impossible to change through agriculture or technology. You cannot grow salt. You cannot breed it. You cannot cultivate a salt field the way you can cultivate a wheat field. The salt is either in your territory or it is not, and if it is not, you must trade for it or go without it and die. This fundamental geographical fact gave salt a different character from other commodities, different from grain, which could in principle be grown locally, or from timber, which could be managed through planting and harvesting. Salt was where it was. The only question was how to move it to where it needed to be. The answer to that question, multiplied across 100 different geographic contexts over 5,000 years of recorded history, is this documentary. It is a massive, complicated, brutally physical answer involving millions of individual human decisions about routes and loads and water and weather and price, decisions made by men whose names we mostly do not know, whose individual experiences we can only partially reconstruct, but whose collective achievement was one of the most important logistical systems in human history. The Sahara is not one thing. People who have not seen it tend to imagine a uniform sea of sand dunes, orange and photogenic and deeply hostile in a cinematic way. The reality is more complex and in some ways more brutal. The Sahara is a continent within a continent, a landmass larger than the United States, containing mountain ranges and dried riverbeds and salt flats and gravel plains and sand seas that stretch beyond the limit of human vision. At its heart, in what is now Mali and Algeria, the desert contains some of the largest salt deposits on Earth. The Great Salt Flat of Tagaza, known today as Taoudeni, sits at roughly 22 degrees north latitude in a basin that was once an ancient inland sea. The salt there lies close to the surface, sometimes only half a metre down, in slabs thick enough to quarry with iron picks. The ancient inhabitants of that region did exactly that. They quarried the salt, cut it into portable blocks, and then faced the impossible question of what to do next. The answer was the trans-Saharan caravan routes, and the most important of those routes ran south, toward the goldfields and population centres of West Africa, toward Timbuktu and Djenné and the Niger River, toward the enormous and hungry markets of the Sahel. The journey from Tagaza to Timbuktu, roughly 800 kilometres as the crow flies, considerably more on the actual ground route, took experienced caravans between 20 and 30 days in reasonable conditions. There were no reasonable conditions. The Sahara is not accommodating to human beings under any circumstances, and certainly not to human beings leading heavily loaded camels across its summer surface, where ground temperatures can exceed 70 degrees Celsius. To survive the crossing, caravanners developed a system of logistics so precise that it bordered on military planning. Water was the organising principle around which everything else arranged itself. The route from Tagaza to Timbuktu had perhaps 8 reliable water sources, wells and oases separated by gaps of sometimes 4 to 5 days of continuous walking. Every calculation was built around those gaps. How much water could a camel carry? How much could a man carry? How many extra water carriers were needed per loaded camel? What was the maximum load a camel could bear while also carrying enough water to make it to the next well? The answers to those questions were not academic. They were existential. Get them wrong, and the caravan died. The desert is full of evidence of caravans that got them wrong, buried under sand that has shifted, uncovered by wind centuries later. The bones of men and animals, the fragments of trade goods, the personal effects of merchants who set out with high hopes and correct mathematics, and were killed by a sandstorm that shifted the landmarks, or a well that had dried up, or a sick camel that had to be abandoned, cascading the weight redistribution onto animals already at the edge of their load capacity. The Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta, who travelled the trans-Saharan route in 1352, described the journey in terms that make clear how finely tuned the system was. He travelled with a caravan of merchants that included a professional water carrier, a man whose entire role was to carry and manage water skins, ensure they were filled at each well to the maximum safe capacity, and ration them with absolute precision between water points. This was not a supplemental role, it was a survival role. Ibn Battuta also described the system of guides, men who knew the desert not by map but by an internalized geography of stars, sand color, prevailing wind direction, and the subtle variations in terrain that were invisible to untrained eyes. These guides were among the most valuable people in the entire trade ecosystem. A good guide was the difference between a profitable journey and mass death. They were paid accordingly, generously, sometimes extravagantly, and they held their knowledge as a closely guarded professional secret. The salt itself determined much of the logistics. The Takhaza salt came out of the ground in irregular chunks that were then processed into standardized slabs, typically about 0.5 meter long, 30 centimeters wide and 10 centimeters thick. 2 slabs were loaded on each side of a camel, 4 to a camel, typically 60 to 80 kilograms of salt per animal. A large caravan might carry 12,000 slabs. Those numbers, the weight, the count, the number of animals, cascaded through every subsequent decision about water, food, speed, and route. And here is the terrible efficiency of the Saharan salt trade. The same camel that was loaded with salt going south was loaded with gold going north. The return journey carried the thing that made West Africa so extraordinarily wealthy and so intensely coveted. The gold from the alluvial fields of Bambouk and Bouré, the mines of Akan, the river gravels of the Senegal and Niger systems, salt south, gold north. For roughly 1,000 years, this trade fueled some of the wealthiest empires in human history. The Mali Empire, which dominated West Africa from the 13th to 15th centuries, controlled both ends of this trade, the goldfields in the south and the Saharan salt mines in the north. The Emperor Mansa Musa, whose 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca with 60,000 people and a baggage train of gold so vast it depressed the Egyptian gold market for 12 years, derived his extraordinary wealth in part from taxing the salt trade that ran through his territory. Salt moved through Mali's markets with a fixed tax rate. Every slab that crossed the Niger was recorded, counted, taxed, and the revenues funneled into the imperial treasury. But the wealth at the top of the system obscures the suffering at its base. In Tagaza itself, the workers who quarried the salt lived in houses built from salt blocks, the only building material available, and depended entirely on food imported from the south, at prices that made them permanently indebted to the merchants who controlled the supply. The Arab historian Al-Umari, writing in the 14th century, described Tagaza as a place of flies and misery, where workers died in the salt pits and were replaced by others who came because there was no other work, and stayed because they could never quite earn enough to leave. This is the pattern that will repeat across every salt route in this documentary. At the top, wealth, empire, taxation, records, history. At the bottom, the people who actually produced and moved the thing that made all of that possible, living and dying in conditions of extraordinary hardship, their individual names lost to the wind. The water discipline required for a successful Saharan crossing would be almost incomprehensible to a modern person accustomed to turning on a tap. Each person in the caravan had a water ration, not a generous one, but a calculated minimum designed to maintain physiological function without any surplus for comfort. Washing was not possible. Drinking beyond the ration was not possible. The water that was available was not cool or pleasant or clean in the modern sense. It came from goatskin bags that imparted a strong animal flavour to everything stored in them, and it was warm from sitting in desert heat, and it was often slightly contaminated by the residues of previous contents. And you drank it. You drank it carefully and gratefully, and with the particular intensity of a person who understands that the liquid in their hand is not refreshment but currency, that every sip represents a portion of the margin between life and death on this crossing. Experienced caravanners developed an almost yogic discipline around water, drinking slowly, in small amounts, at regular intervals rather than gulping when thirsty, because the sensation of thirst lagged behind actual dehydration and could be managed better by schedule than by sensation. The caravans that failed were often the ones that misjudged this discipline, that allowed water rationing to slip in the first days when the desert still felt manageable and the wells ahead still seemed reachable, only to find themselves critically short in the middle crossing when there was no margin for error. The bones found in the deep Sahara, the occasional archaeological traces of caravans that did not make it, bear mute witness to what happened when the arithmetic went wrong. There was also the matter of navigation. The Sahara has no permanent landmarks visible at ground level over much of its surface. The sand dunes shift. The wind obliterates tracks. A sandstorm can reduce visibility to 0 in minutes and last for hours or days, after which the landscape has been rearranged and the stars, the primary navigational reference for desert travellers, are hidden. The guides who led caravans across the deep Sahara navigated by a combination of stellar observation, attention to subtle terrain features invisible to untrained eyes, and an internalized knowledge of the route that was built through years of repeated crossings. This knowledge was extraordinarily valuable and was maintained as a professional secret. A guide who shared his route knowledge too freely was undercutting his own market value. The scarcity of reliable guides was what made the profession lucrative. So the knowledge passed from master to apprentice, from father to son, in a tradition of oral transmission that preserved the routes as a kind of geographical expertise available only to those who'd earned it through years of training. The specific landmarks a guide used, the colour of sand at a particular point, the direction of the prevailing wind at certain season, the angle of the sun at midday relative to a barely visible ridge. These were not written down. They could not be written down in any way that preserved their meaning to someone who had not seen the actual terrain. They lived in the guide's body, in the pattern recognition systems trained by thousands of miles of walking, and when the guide died, they died with him unless he had trained a successor well enough. The sandstorm is the Sahara's most democratic terror. It does not distinguish between the experienced caravan master and the first-time traveller, between the wealthy merchant and the indebted camel handler. When the wall of sand comes, and it comes fast, a brown curtain that can rise from the horizon to the zenith in 20 minutes, Everyone and everything in its path is equally helpless. The camels are couched. The cargo is covered as well as it can be. The men bury their faces in cloth and wait. The storms could last for hours, for days. A particularly severe sandstorm might pin a caravan in place for 3 days, their water supplies ticking down toward the critical threshold, the animals refusing to drink the sand-contaminated water at the bottom of the skins, the food supplies gradually depleted by people who had nothing to do but eat. Every hour of a sandstorm were an hour subtracted from the margin between the current water supply and the next well. After a sandstorm, the landscape was different. Dunes had moved. The great sand formations that served as landmarks were in new positions, or had shifted their profiles enough to be unrecognizable. Tracks were gone. The gentle hollows in the terrain that had guided experienced travelers were filled in. The guide's internalized map had to be recalibrated against an environment that had rearranged itself. This was when guides earned their reputation. The ability to reorient after a multi-day sandstorm, to read the new landscape against the remembered map, to identify the sun's position through residual haze, to find the subtle terrain features that the sand had not entirely obscured, was the difference between a guide whose caravan survived and a guide whose caravans provided the bones that later travellers found half buried in drifts. The economics of the salt trade had to absorb the cost of these disruptions. A caravan that was delayed by 3 days in a sandstorm arrived at its destination 3 days later than expected, with animals in poorer condition and with the compounding costs of extra water and food consumed during the wait. The merchant who had arranged to sell his salt on a specific date at a specific market found himself negotiating with buyers who had made alternative arrangements. Prices fell. The margin that had looked adequate in Tagaza looked much thinner in Timbuktu, and yet the caravans kept coming. Season after season, century after century, through sandstorms and water shortages and bandit raids and political disruptions and the death of animals and the death of men, the salt kept moving south and the gold kept moving north. The system was robust not because it was efficient but because it was necessary. The populations of the Sahel needed the salt. The populations of the Maghreb needed the gold. The need was stronger than the hardship. The need was always stronger than the hardship. A trans-Saharan caravan was not a loose gathering of merchants who happened to be going in the same direction. It was a precise, hierarchical, quasi-military organization. A mobile city, complete with its own laws, its own social structure, its own system of credit and obligation, and its own mortality rate. The largest caravans of the trans-Saharan trade numbered in the thousands of animals and hundreds of people. The 1352 caravan that Ibn Battuta joined was described as containing roughly 600 camels. Leo Africanus, writing in the 16th century, described a caravan he witnessed leaving Timbuktu for Morocco that he estimated at 12,000 camels. Even allowing for the tendency of medieval writers to inflate numbers, this represents a logistical operation of staggering complexity. At the head of it was the caravan leader, in Arabic the Nakib, in the Berber languages of the Sahara, the Amgar. This was not an honorary title. The caravan leader was the commanding officer of a moving enterprise, responsible for route decisions, water management, pacing, dispute resolution, security arrangements, and the collective survival of everyone and everything in his charge. A bad caravan leader was not just an inconvenience, he was a death sentence. The social hierarchy below the caravan leader was complex and carefully maintained. Senior merchants, those who had made the crossing multiple times and had established reputations for reliability, occupied a position of informal authority even without official titles. first-time travellers, apprentice merchants, and the servants and workers who managed the animals were at the bottom. Between them was everyone else: the guides, the water carriers, the cooks, the physicians, the blacksmiths who repaired equipment, the guards who provided security against raiding parties. Yes, physicians. A large caravan carried at least one trained medical practitioner, someone versed in the treatment of heat stroke, dehydration, intestinal illness, infected wounds, camel bites, and the dozens of other injuries and illnesses that a long desert crossing reliably produced. The physician was paid a flat fee for the journey, and an additional sum if the mortality rate among the caravan members stayed below a certain threshold. This created somewhat grimly exactly the right incentives. The daily rhythm of the caravan was set not by the clock but by the sun and the animals. Rising before dawn, travelling through the relative cool of early morning, stopping at the heat of the day to rest the animals, resuming in the late afternoon and travelling until well after dark. A good day's march covered between 30 and 40 kilometres. A bad day, heavy loads, weak animals, difficult terrain, might cover 15. The camels were everything. The Bactrian camel of Central Asia and the dromedary of the Middle East and Africa were not just pack animals. They were the biological technology that made long-distance desert trade possible. A healthy adult dromedary could carry between 200 and 300 kilograms of cargo for days at a time without water, drawing on the fat reserves in its hump and extracting moisture from the dry plant matter it consumed. When it did drink, it could consume 100 litres of water in 10 minutes, hydrating from catastrophic dehydration to full capacity in a single watering session. Adoption of the dromedary in the Sahara, which occurred gradually between roughly 200 BCE and 300 CE. Trans-Saharan trade existed but was limited to coastal and near-coastal routes, moving goods by donkey and on human backs across manageable distances. The camel did not just expand those routes, it made entirely new routes possible, routes through the deep desert that had previously been death traps. But the camel was also fragile in ways that its reputation for toughness tends to obscure. An overloaded camel would quietly decline. Not protest dramatically, but slowly fail, its gait becoming irregular, its food consumption dropping, its body condition deteriorating. A caravan master who did not notice these early warning signs would find himself with a dead camel, and no warning. The load it had been carrying suddenly distributed among already burdened animals, cascading toward catastrophe. The camel handlers, the men whose entire professional expertise was the management and care of the animals, were among the most technically skilled people in the caravan. They knew how to load a saddle to distribute weight correctly. They knew the difference between a camel that was tired and a camel that was sick. They could diagnose mange and hoof problems and respiratory infections at a glance. They knew how to rehydrate a severely dehydrated animal without causing rupture, and they guarded this knowledge jealously, because it was the foundation of their economic position. At night, the caravan formed a defensive perimeter. The camels were couched in a large oval, their load still strapped on or stacked nearby. Guards walked the perimeter in shifts. The merchants slept in the centre. The fires were kept small, not enough to attract attention, just enough to provide the minimum warmth against the desert night, which could drop 30 degrees from the daytime high. And then, before the sun rose, the whole machine started again. Load, marshal, lead, walk. The great moving engine of commerce, crossing the world's most hostile terrain, one grinding day at a time. The social dynamics of a caravan under stress were complex and occasionally explosive. Merchants who had invested heavily in a cargo and found the journey going badly, saw animals dying, water running short, a companion falling sick, faced mounting anxiety that could express itself as demands on the caravan master for faster pace, shorter rest stops, different route choices. The caravan master had to manage these pressures while also making decisions based on his assessment of what the animals and the people could actually sustain. This produced a constant low-level negotiation between commercial interest and physical reality. The merchant wanted speed. The camel handler knew the lead camel was beginning to show signs of fatigue. The guide wanted to make a detour to a smaller, less-known water source he trusted more than the main well, which he suspected might be fouled by recent animal activity. The physician was watching three men whose complexion suggested the early stages of dehydration-induced heat stress. The caravan master had to weigh all of this simultaneously while also walking. Disputes were resolved in well-organized caravans by the caravan master's authority, which was absolute during the crossing in the same way that a ship captain's authority was absolute at sea. His decision on route, pace, water rationing, and rest was final. Merchants who refused to accept this authority were, in theory, free to leave the caravan and proceed independently, which was functionally equivalent to a death sentence, since the caravan's collective resources and the guide's knowledge were what made the crossing survivable. The informal legal systems that governed caravan life extended beyond the crossing itself. Caravans carried credit instruments, written records of debts and obligations between merchants, some of them sophisticated enough to serve as primitive bills of exchange or letters of credit. These instruments were honored across the entire trading network because the network's commercial relationships depended on their reliability. A merchant who defaulted on a caravan debt did not just lose money. He lost access to future caravans, which meant he lost his livelihood. The reputation system that enforced caravan credit was more effective than any formal legal system. The commercial law of the caravan was an accumulation of custom and precedent, developed over centuries by people who needed workable rules and had no access to formal legal systems to provide them. Contract disputes between merchants of different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, disputes that might involve complex questions of credit, delivery, quality, and liability for loss, were resolved through a mixture of mediation by respected caravan members, appeal to precedents established in similar cases on previous journeys, and the implicit threat that a merchant who gained a reputation for bad faith would lose access to the network. The reputation network was, in many ways, more effective than formal legal enforcement would have been. A merchant cheated in a caravan dispute in Timbuktu in 1350 could not take his case to a court that had jurisdiction over a counterparty in Marrakesh, but he could, and did, report the incident to the commercial networks of both cities, to the caravanserais, the merchants' associations, the trading houses, and ensure that the information about the disputed transaction reached everyone who might do business with his counterparty in the future. This reputational enforcement system worked because the caravan trade was a repeat game environment. The merchants who participated in the trans-Saharan trade were not strangers who met once and never again. They were members of a relatively small commercial world who encountered each other repeatedly across years and decades of trading activity. The value of a reputation for honesty, for delivering what you promised, paying what you owed, absorbing losses you were responsible for rather than disputing them, compounded over time in a way that made it economically rational to maintain even at short-term cost. The medieval Jewish traders known as the Cairo-Geniza merchants, whose commercial correspondence, preserved by accident in a Cairo synagogue for nearly 1,000 years, gives us the most detailed picture we have of medieval long-distance trade, operated almost entirely on this reputational credit system. Their letters describe commercial arrangements of great complexity, involving multiple parties across multiple cities and years of time, all maintained without formal legal enforcement, purely through the mutual assurance of people who knew that their commercial future depended on being known as reliable. Salt moved through these networks as one commodity among many, but its bulk and its necessity gave it a particular character. The margins on salt trade were lower than on luxury goods. You could not achieve the spectacular profits on a single lucky transaction that a successful spice shipment or a fortuitously timed gold purchase might produce. Salt profit was grinding, accumulated over many transactions, dependent on volume and reliability rather than spectacular individual deals. The salt merchant was, by the nature of his commodity, a methodical person, someone whose success came from doing the same thing correctly, over and over, across a career of carefully managed risk. Rome was built, quite literally, on salt. The city's position at the mouth of the Tiber, on the western coast of the Italian peninsula, placed it adjacent to what were, in the ancient world, some of the most productive salt pans in the Mediterranean. The Salinae Ostienses, the salt works at Ostia, had been producing salt since at least the 7th century BCE, before Rome was an empire, before it was a republic, when it was barely a settlement. Those salt works were the foundation of Roman commercial power long before the legions were. Salt was what the early Romans traded, what they paid for goods and services, what gave them economic leverage over their inland neighbours who had no direct access to the sea. And the road they built to move that salt from the coast to the interior became one of the most famous roads in history. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, is believed to be one of the oldest roads in Italy. It ran from the salt pans at Ostia northeast through the Sabine Hills, and eventually all the way to the Adriatic coast, a journey of roughly 240 kilometres. Along its length, salt moved in one direction, and the goods of inland Italy, grain, wool, pottery, slaves, moved in the other. It was a commercial artery, but it was also an infrastructural achievement that demonstrated something important about Rome's relationship to logistics. Rome understood, earlier than almost any other ancient civilization, that control of supply routes was equivalent to military power. You did not need to own the salt deposits of your neighbours if you controlled the roads that moved salt to them. You did not need to conquer the grain fields of North Africa if you controlled the ports where grain ships docked. The Via Salaria was, in this sense, not just a road. It was a statement of Roman commercial philosophy. By the late Republic, Rome's salt supply had become a matter of state security. The Republican government controlled salt production directly through a system of public ownership. The salinae were not privately operated but administered by magistrates who set production levels, managed distribution, and controlled prices. When grain was expensive during a shortage, Rome sometimes subsidized salt as a matter of public welfare, ensuring that even the poorest citizens could afford the minimum dietary requirement. The Roman salt monopoly was a sophisticated exercise in state economic management. Salt taxes, the salarium, funded military campaigns. Salt price controls prevented the kind of social instability that could arise when poor populations could not afford dietary essentials. The system created, for several centuries, a remarkably stable salt supply in a Mediterranean world that was otherwise frequently disrupted by war, drought, and political chaos. But the logistics of the system were enormous. The salt pans at Ostia could produce large volumes, but they required constant labour. The maintenance of evaporation channels, the management of water flow, the physical raking and collection of crystallized salt, the transport of the product away from the pans. The Roman state employed directly or contracted through private companies thousands of workers in the salt production system. Their working conditions were harsh in ways that Roman administrative documents record, with the clinical detachment of management accounting. The salt pans themselves were punishing environments. Workers stood in water for hours, breathing salt-laden air, developing the characteristic skin problems, cracking, bleeding, chronic inflammation that salt brine contact produces. Eye problems were endemic. Respiratory conditions from the fine salt dust that rose during collection and processing shortened lifespans. The Romans knew this. Their texts mention it in passing, in the same tone used to note that mining was dangerous, or that gladiatorial training was exhausting. Beyond the pans, the Via Salaria imposed its own costs. The road required constant maintenance. The fitted stone blocks cracked under the weight of heavy carts. Frost damage in the higher altitudes of the Sabine Hills required regular repair. Bridges over the seasonal streams of the Apennines needed reinforcement. The Roman state maintained a system of road supervisors and maintenance crews, but the cost was significant and recurring. The carts themselves, massive ox-drawn vehicles loaded with salt in heavy clay amphorae or woven baskets, moved at roughly 3 to 4 kilometers per hour on good road. A full load of salt, the round trip from Ostia to Rome and back, might take 2 to 3 days each way. For the further reaches of the Via Salaria into the Sabine Hills and beyond, the journey stretched to weeks, and yet it worked. For nearly 1,000 years, Rome's salt supply system delivered the product with a reliability that was, by ancient standards, extraordinary. When the system finally broke down, as the empire contracted, as the roads deteriorated, as the administrative apparatus that managed the state monopoly dissolved in the chaos of the 5th century, the consequences were felt immediately in the price of salt in inland markets and in the food security of populations that had come to depend on cheap, readily available salt for food preservation. The Via Salaria is still there. You can drive it today, largely following the original Roman alignment, through the hills east of Rome toward the Adriatic, the road that moved an empire's lifeblood, paved with stones cut by hands that had been dust for 2,000 years. The Roman obsession with salt management extended to the strategic dimension of empire building in ways that historians have sometimes underestimated. When Roman armies moved into new territories, one of the early administrative priorities was establishing reliable salt supply chains for the legions. A Roman legion consumed enormous quantities of salt, for the soldiers' rations directly, for the preservation of the meat that formed a substantial part of military diet, and for the veterinary care of the horses and mules that carried the army's equipment. The logistics of supplying a legion in the field were genuinely extraordinary. A standard Roman legion of approximately 5,000 men required daily resupply of food, water, fuel, and equipment, a supply chain that extended back to the nearest established base, which might be hundreds of kilometers away. Within that supply chain, salt was a constant non-negotiable requirement. When the supply chain broke down, when a legion was cut off, surrounded, or operating beyond the reach of its supply network, the absence of salt for food preservation made dietary problems acute within days. The Roman solution was to make salt supply part of military infrastructure, to build the roads that carried salt as military roads, to maintain the salt works as state property, and to price salt in civilian markets in ways that guaranteed availability. This was not pure altruism. A hungry, salt-deficient civilian population was a politically unstable one, and political instability was a military problem. The Roman state's management of salt supply was, in this sense, an extension of its security policy. The garum industry, the Roman fermented fish sauce that was the ketchup of the ancient Mediterranean, was another dimension of Roman salt economics. Garum was made by fermenting small fish in concentrated salt brine for months, then straining off the liquid. The result was an intensely savoury condiment that provided both flavour and sodium to a diet that might otherwise be bland and nutritionally deficient. The garum factories of the Roman world, large operations documented archaeologically at sites in Spain, Morocco, Portugal and Italy, consumed enormous quantities of salt. They were, in effect, salt-intensive food processing industries built to serve the Mediterranean's largest consumer market. The Roman army's relationship to salt went beyond the salarium. It structured the entire logistical system of military supply in ways that shaped how Roman armies were able to operate over the extraordinary distances that empire demanded. The preservation of food, particularly meat and fish, through salting was the technology that made extended military campaigns viable. Without reliable salt-preserved rations, a Roman army operating more than 2 or 3 days from a supply depot was in serious nutritional danger. The quartermasters who managed Roman military supply, the praefecti annoni of the military establishment, understood salt as a strategic material in the same category as iron and timber. Supply disruptions were not merely inconvenient, they were tactically disabling. An army that could not salt its meat was an army that could not campaign for more than a few days without returning to a fixed supply base. The infrastructure of Roman salt supply, the roads, the warehouses, the distribution networks, was therefore partly a military infrastructure, maintained at state expense not merely for civilian dietary comfort but for strategic necessity. The legions stationed on the frontiers of the empire, on the Rhine and Danube in Britain in the deserts of Syria, required constant resupply over distances that would have been logistically impossible without the road networks and preservation technologies that salt trade had helped create. A garrison on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain was receiving salt-preserved fish from the Channel coast, salt-preserved olive oil from Spain, and salt-preserved grain from North Africa. The empire's dietary supply chain was global by the standards of the ancient world, and salt was the technology that made it function. When the Western Roman supply chains broke down in the 5th century, when the administrative apparatus that maintained the roads, the ships, the warehouses, and the distribution networks dissolved under the pressure of military invasion, political fragmentation, and economic contraction, the dietary consequences were immediate and severe. The populations of inland cities and frontier regions that had relied on preserved foods from distant sources found themselves suddenly dependent on what could be produced locally. The shift from a continental dietary supply chain to a local one was not just an economic disruption, it was a dietary catastrophe, particularly for urban populations that had grown beyond the carrying capacity of their immediate agricultural hinterland. Everyone has heard of the Silk Road. Most people know it as the route that carried Chinese silk to Rome and Roman glass to China, that transmitted Buddhism from India to East Asia and Islam from Arabia to the Central Asian steppes. It is taught in schools as a story of cultural exchange and exotic luxury goods, the famous trade in silk and spice and precious metal that connected the ancient world's great civilizations. What is less often taught is that the Silk Road's most consistently traded commodity was not silk. It was not spice. It was salt. The Central Asian Plateau, the vast semi-arid steppe and highland region stretching from the Caspian Sea to the borders of China, contains enormous salt deposits. The dried lake beds of the Aral Sea Basin, the salt flats of the Taklamakan Desert, the deposits around the ancient Sogdian cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, and the lake salt sources of Tibet and western China all produced mineral salt in quantities far exceeding local consumption, and the populations of the great river valleys and mountain fastnesses of Central Asia needed salt as urgently as any other human population in history. The Sogdians were the great merchants of the Silk Road, a culture of professional traders, mostly based in what is now Uzbekistan, who dominated Central Asian commerce from roughly the 4th to 8th centuries CE. Sogdian merchants' letters, discovered in the early 20th century sealed in an abandoned watchtower at Dunhuang in western China, and dated to around 313 CE, give us a remarkable window into the day-to-day realities of Silk Road commerce. Those letters are largely about business problems, an agent who has failed to sell his musk at the expected price, a shipment of pepper delayed by bandits, credit arrangements gone wrong, and salt, always salt, noted in the same matter-of-fact terms as any other commodity, priced and weighed and counted with the same attention to detail as silk or lapis lazuli. The logistics of moving salt across Central Asia were shaped by the landscape in ways that differed fundamentally from the Saharan routes. Where the Sahara was flat and open and navigable by long-range landmark, Central Asia was a landscape of corridors and obstacles, mountain ranges that could only be crossed at specific passes, river valleys that had to be followed because the land between them was impassable, desert zones that required careful watering point management very similar to the Saharan system. The Tian Shan Mountains, the Heavenly Mountains running roughly east-west along the modern border between China and Kyrgyzstan, were the Great Barrier of the Northern Silk Road. The passes over them sat at 4,000 meters and above, navigable only in summer and early autumn, closed by snow from October to May. A merchant who mistimed his crossing, who reached the pass late in the season, underestimated the first snowfall, or was delayed by illness or banditry and arrived at the high passes after the first October storms, died there. The mountains are full of those dead. The solution to the mountain problem was the caravanserai system, a network of way stations, typically a day's travel apart, that provided shelter, food, water and storage facilities for merchants and their animals. The caravanserai was one of the great infrastructural innovations of the ancient and medieval world, built and maintained first by Persian Achaemenid administrators and later expanded by successive Central Asian empires, the Seleucids, the Kushans, the Sasanians, the early Islamic caliphates. The caravanserai network was the logistics backbone of the Silk Road. A good caravanserai was a small city. It contained stabling for hundreds of animals, storage facilities secure enough to hold high-value cargo, sleeping quarters for merchants and their workers, a kitchen and bathhouse, a small mosque or shrine, and sometimes a physician and a money changer. The combination of services was deliberate. It was designed to make the caravanserai the commercial centre of its region, the place where merchants gathered not just to rest but to trade, exchange information, negotiate prices, and form the partnerships that made long-distance commerce possible. Salt moved through this system in both directions. Chinese lake salt, particularly the product of the Qinghai Lake Basin, and the salt pans of the Yellow River Valley, moved west along the northern route towards Central Asia. Central Asian rock salt and steppe salt moved east toward the densely populated river valleys of China. Tibetan salt, extracted from high-altitude lakes at extraordinary effort by Buddhist monks and laypeople, whose communities depended on the trade income, moved in both directions through the mountain passes that connected the Tibetan plateau to the surrounding lowlands. The Tibetan salt trade deserves particular attention because it illustrates, with unusual clarity, the relationship between extreme environment and extraordinary effort that defines the entire history of ancient salt logistics. The salt lakes of Tibet, Namtso, Silingko, Dagzako, and dozens of others, sit at altitudes between 4,000 and 5,000 meters. The air is thin enough to make even moderate exertion feel like heavy labor. The climate can shift from warm sunshine to blizzard in hours. And yet for centuries organized parties of workers traveled to these lakes, harvested the salt by hand using wooden tools, loaded it onto yaks, and carried it down through mountain passes to markets in the valleys below. The yak was the camel of the Himalaya, a biological adaptation to altitude that made high mountain transport possible in the same way the dromedary made desert transport possible. A yak could carry 150 kilograms at altitudes where horses collapse from oxygen deprivation, and it could navigate the narrow, icy trails of the high passes with the sure-footedness that seemed to defy physics. The yak-based salt trade of Tibet was not as famous as the camel caravans of the Sahara, but it was arguably more technically demanding, and it was carried out year after year by communities whose survival depended on getting it right. The Sogdian merchants whose letters were found at Dunhuang operated in an environment of extraordinary risk. The Silk Road was not one road, but a bundle of routes, northern, southern, and central, threading through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Taklamakan Desert, which forms the core of the Tarim Basin in what is now western China, was known to its ancient travellers by a name that translates, roughly, as "you go in and you don't come out." This was not hyperbole. The desert's interior is one of the most arid places on Earth, with annual rainfall near zero and summer temperatures that exceed 50 degrees Celsius. The oasis cities that ring the Taklamakan, Kashgar, Khotan, Yarkand, Dunhuang, existed precisely because they were the points where water sources made life possible in an otherwise impassable desert. They were also, not coincidentally, the points where the Silk Road caravans stopped, traded, rested, and reorganized. Each oasis city developed its own commercial identity and its own specialty. Khotan for jade and silk, Kashgar for its position at the junction of routes from India and Central Asia, Dunhuang as the gateway between China and the western routes. Salt moved through these oasis cities as part of a larger commodity flow, one item among many in the mixed cargoes that made long-distance Silk Road trade financially viable. The economics of long-distance trade required a mix of high-value and bulk commodities, the silk and spice and lapis lazuli that provided the profit margin, and the salt and grain and ordinary textiles that provided the volume that kept the caravans commercially viable on legs of the journey where luxury goods were not available. The Sogdian letters found at Dunhuang provide a glimpse into the anxious underside of this commercial system. The letter written by a woman named Nanaidat to her mother, describing how she and other Sogdian women had been abandoned in Dunhuang by their travelling companions after funds ran out and merchants failed to arrive as promised, reveals the human vulnerability beneath the grand commercial facade of the Silk Road. She describes going hungry, wearing rags, being at the mercy of strangers in a foreign city, waiting for news that did not come. The Silk Road was many things. For many of the people in it, it was a trap. The Pamirs, the knot of mountain ranges at the junction of what is now Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and western China. were the great physical challenge of the Silk Road's most direct routes. The passes over the Pamirs sat at between 4,000 and 5,000 metres, in terrain so high that altitude sickness was a genuine danger for lowland travellers who had not had time to acclimatise. The symptoms, headache, nausea, cognitive confusion, pulmonary edema in severe cases, were well documented by Silk Road travellers who had no understanding of their cause but recognised their effects with painful clarity. The Xuanzang, the 7th century Chinese Buddhist monk whose journey to India and back became the inspiration for the novel Journey to the West, crossed the Pamirs twice and left detailed descriptions of the crossing that make clear both the physical ordeal and the logistical challenge. He describes cold so severe that ink froze in his writing brush. He describes trails so narrow that pack animals had to be led one by one around exposed corners, and where one misstep meant a 1,000-metre fall. He describes the particular misery of sleeping at altitude in clothing designed for lowland temperatures, his body unable to generate enough heat despite being bundled in everything he carried. And he was travelling lightly, as a pilgrim. The salt caravans that crossed these passes carried hundreds of kilograms of cargo per animal, on animals that were working at the physiological edge of their altitude tolerance. A donkey or a horse at 4,000 metres is carrying perhaps 60% of the load it could manage at sea level, while consuming calories at an elevated rate to generate body heat. The caloric and logistical calculations that were already tight at lower altitudes became genuinely precarious at Pamir heights. The solution, for the most experienced Silk Road operators, was to use the mountain people themselves as the high-altitude logistics specialists. The various peoples of the Pamirs and Tian Shan, the Kyrgyz, the Wakhi, the Tajik mountain communities, had generations of experience moving cargo at altitude with animals adapted to the conditions. They operated as specialized logistics contractors for the lowland merchants, taking delivery of cargo at the foot of the mountains, moving it over the passes using their own mountain-adapted animals and their own knowledge of the routes, and delivering it on the other side to agents of the original merchant. The transaction cost was real, but the alternative, trying to take lowland caravan animals over high mountain passes with lowland merchants who had never experienced altitude, was often fatal. We have talked about the routes, we have talked about the logistics, the camels, the caravanserais, the guides and water carriers and caravan masters. Now we need to talk about the bodies, because the history of ancient salt transport is also a history of physical destruction, of the specific documented ways in which salt work and salt carrying broke the human body, year by year, mile by mile. Salt is, chemically, an aggressive substance. Prolonged skin contact causes chronic dermatitis, inflammation and cracking that can penetrate to the subcutaneous layer, creating open wounds that become infected, that heal slowly or not at all, that in the absence of modern antibiotics could develop into systemic infections with fatal outcomes. Salt pan workers in every period and culture from which we have records, Egyptian, Roman, medieval European, early modern, show signs of this condition in the historical accounts that mention them at all. The eyes were particularly vulnerable. Salt brine spray caused a chronic conjunctivitis that, over years of exposure, could progress to corneal damage and partial blindness. Ancient Egyptians understood this connection well enough to mention it in their medical papyri. The Ebers. Papyrus includes treatments for what appears to be the occupational eye disease of salt workers, using honey and plant extracts as anti-inflammatory agents. The treatments were partially effective at best. Salt pan workers in the ancient world went blind at rates that were almost certainly higher than the general population, though we cannot put precise numbers on it. The respiratory system paid an equally high price. Dry salt environments, the quarrying operations at Tagaza, the underground mines of Central Europe, the salt flat harvesting operations of any arid climate, produced fine salt dust that entered the lungs and caused a condition now recognized as respiratory salt toxicity. The immediate effects were coughing and bronchial inflammation. The long-term effects from chronic exposure over years included reduced lung capacity, increased susceptibility to respiratory infections, and probably a form of silicosis-like scarring of the lung tissue. Ancient texts describe salt miners with chronic coughs in terms that suggest this was recognized as an occupational hazard, not treatable, not preventable, simply expected. The salt miners of Hallstatt in the Austrian Alps, whose operations date back to roughly 1200 BCE, making them among the oldest continuously operated mines in the world, left behind what archaeologists call the Iron Age mine workers. Skeletal remains from burial sites associated with the Hallstatt mine show patterns of spinal deformation consistent with the carrying of heavy loads from an early age, vertebral compression fractures, osteophyte formation on the loading vertebrae, early onset osteoarthritis in the knees and hips. The skeleton bears the signature of a life spent underground, carrying rock salt on a wooden backframe up narrow passages barely large enough for a man to pass through. The Hallstatt mines are extraordinarily well preserved by the salt itself, which acts as a natural preservative. Archaeologists excavating the site in the 19th and 20th centuries recovered not just tools and equipment, but organic materials, leather goods, wooden implements, textiles, even food remains, in a state of preservation unusual for materials more than 2,000 years old. Among the finds were the preserved remains of mine workers, men who had died underground, their bodies gradually mummified by the salt environment that had also ended their lives. One such preserved body, known informally to archaeologists as the Man in Salt, was found in the Hallstatt mine in 1734. He had died in a roof collapse, buried under a fall of rock salt that had simultaneously killed him and preserved his body. When found, he was described as complete and recognizable, his clothing and equipment intact. He's been dated by subsequent analysis to roughly the 16th century CE, 500 years before his discovery. The salt had kept him. For the men and women who walked the long-distance routes, the caravanners of the Sahara and the Silk Road, the physical toll was different but equally severe. Long-distance walking at altitude, carrying loads or managing heavily loaded animals, imposed stresses on the musculoskeletal system that accumulated over years. Plantar fasciitis, stress fractures of the metatarsals, chronic knee problems, and lumbar spinal damage are all documented in the skeletal remains of individuals identified as probable long-distance traders or workers in ancient contexts. Dehydration was the most immediate threat and the most commonly fatal. The early stages, thirst, reduced urine output, declining cognitive performance, were manageable and well understood by experienced travellers. But the later stages happened fast and were hard to reverse. Rapid heart rate, confusion, hallucination, organ damage, coma. The critical threshold in a hot desert environment could be reached in 4 to 6 hours of extreme exertion without water access. The human body's inability to store water in the way a camel does was the single greatest logistical constraint on ancient desert travel. And then there were the diseases. The long-distance salt routes passed through malaria zones, through regions where dysentery was endemic, through communities where plague occasionally lurked. A caravan travelling from the salt pans of the Sahel to the markets of the North African coast might begin the journey healthy and arrive with a third of its members sick, the cost of their illness absorbed into the price of the salt they carried. Nobody who survived multiple Saharan crossings was physically the same afterward. The men who made the trans-Saharan route their livelihood, the professional caravanners who spent their working lives on the road, tended to look older than their years, to carry chronic injuries that slowed but did not stop them, to have the particular quality of endurance that comes not from strength, but from the complete internalization of suffering as a normal condition of existence. The price of salt, in human physical terms, was enormous. The price in the markets was the small visible part. The invisible part was paid by the bodies of the men who got it there. The mathematics of a salt worker's life were always unfavourable. Consider the situation at Tagaza in the 14th century. A skilled quarryman could extract and process perhaps 300 kilograms of salt per day, roughly 6 standard trade blocks on a good day, working in the salt pits from first light to last. The payment for this work was a fixed daily rate in foodstuffs and sometimes a small cash supplement. But the price of those foodstuffs, imported from thousands of kilometres away and sold at Tagaza's isolated city premium, consumed most of that daily rate. The net result was a debt trap of remarkable efficiency. The worker could earn enough to survive but not enough to leave. To accumulate the capital needed to pay for a return journey, the caravan fees, the water costs, the food for the road, required months of saving at a rate that the food prices made nearly impossible. And while the worker saved, the debt he had accumulated during periods of illness or bad weather or reduced production continued to accrue. The company store was not a modern invention. The physical degradation of salt work accelerated this trap. A young man who came to Tagaza healthy might be a productive quarryman for 10 years before the cumulative effects of salt exposure, the respiratory problems, the eye damage, the chronic skin conditions, the spinal injuries from heavy lifting, reduced his productivity below the minimum that the management could tolerate. At that point he was not fired exactly. He was simply given less work, which reduced his income below subsistence, which increased his debt, which made his situation more precarious. Some workers left Tagaza by joining the southbound salt caravans as labour, as camel handlers, water carriers, guards, accepting wages that at least included the caravan food and water that would get them as far as the Sahel. A few made it back to their home communities with enough resources to start over. Many did not. They fell sick on the road, or spent what they had earned in Timbuktu before they could save enough to go further, or simply found that their home communities no longer had a place for them after years of absence. The gender dimension of salt labour is largely invisible in the historical record, which tends to focus on the large-scale commercial operations, the mines, the caravans, the trading houses, that were predominantly male spaces. But at the domestic scale, the labour of processing and managing salt was often women's work, and it was constant, grinding and physically demanding. Rock salt from the mines came in irregular chunks that had to be ground to powder or broken to usable size before they could be used for food preservation. This grinding, done by hand on stone querns in most ancient and medieval households, was slow, difficult work that produced clouds of fine salt dust and required sustained upper body effort. The preserved skin condition that we see in salt worker skeletal remains appears in domestic contexts as well. Women who spent significant portions of their lives grinding salt and packing salt into preserving vessels developed the same characteristic hand and wrist problems as professional salt handlers. The management of a household salt supply, measuring it out carefully across the winter, rationing it between the meat preserving that had to happen in late autumn and the everyday cooking requirements of the intervening months, making the supply last until the next opportunity to purchase more, was a form of domestic logistics that required real skill and sustained attention. Getting it wrong meant either running out of salt before spring, with the dietary and food safety consequences that entailed, or using too much at the beginning and having insufficient for the final preservation needs at the end of the season. This domestic salt economy was the base of the entire commercial system we've been tracing across empires and continents. The great Saharan caravans, the Roman Via Salaria, the Silk Road salt merchants of Central Asia, all of it terminated ultimately in a household where someone was carefully measuring out salt for a specific purpose, making the specific local decisions about how to use a resource that had travelled an extraordinary distance to reach them. The chain ran from the Tagaza salt flat to the kitchen in Timbuktu, from the Roman salt pan at Ostia to the farmhouse in the Sabine Hills, from the Tibetan lake to the monastery kitchen at the foot of the Himalayas, and at the end of every chain was a hand, usually statistically a woman's hand, measuring out what was needed and putting the rest carefully away. Salt has started wars, not metaphorically, literally. Documented military conflicts from the ancient world to the early modern period were fought for control of salt production sites, salt trade routes, or the tax revenues that salt commerce generated. The combination of universal necessity and geographic scarcity made salt one of the most reliably contested commodities in human history. The earliest documented salt-related military conflict on record involves the ancient Chinese state of Qi, which during the spring and autumn period, 771–476 BCE, controlled the salt production operations along the eastern coast of what is now Shandong province. The statesman Guanzhong, serving as prime minister to Duke Huan of Qi in the 7th century BCE, reorganized the state's salt monopoly into an instrument of foreign policy, using control of coastal salt production to financially dominate neighboring states that had no equivalent salt sources. The strategy was elegant in its brutality. States that needed Qi salt, and most of the Yellow River Valley states did, were forced to pay Qi's prices, which could be raised or lowered in response to political circumstances. States that resisted paid in military invasion. The salt monopoly was backed, always, by the implied or actual threat of force. Guanzhong understood, with a clarity unusual in any age, that control of a dietary necessity was equivalent to political control of the population that consumed it. The Roman Republic's wars of expansion in Italy were partly motivated by access to salt resources. The early conflict between Rome and the Etruscan city of Veii, which controlled important salt production sites in the Tiber Valley, was not merely a territorial dispute. It was a commercial war over salt revenues. When Rome finally destroyed Veii in 396 BCE after a 10-year siege, one of the first administrative acts was the reorganization of the captured salt works under Roman state control. In medieval Europe, the salt trade generated conflicts that reshaped political maps. The rivalry between the cities of Hamburg and Lübeck, both of which grew enormously wealthy from the salt trade that preserved the Baltic herring industry, drove the formation of the Hanseatic League, the great commercial alliance of northern European cities that dominated Baltic and North Sea commerce from the 12th to 17th centuries. The Hanseatic League was, in its origins, partly a protection racket for salt merchants, a collective security arrangement to prevent any single city or prince from imposing ruinous taxes on the salt trade that the entire herring industry depended on. The herring, rather than the salt, tends to get the credit in historical accounts of the Hanseatic League, but without salt, specifically, without the enormous quantities of bay salt from the Atlantic coast of France, shipped north to the Baltic herring grounds by Hanseatic vessels, there would have been no preserved herring to trade, no herring trade to finance, and no Hanseatic League to protect it. Salt was the invisible foundation of the entire system. The most famous salt war in European history is arguably the Salzburg Salt Wars, a series of conflicts in the 15th and 16th centuries between the prince-archbishops of Salzburg, who controlled some of the most productive salt mines in Central Europe, and the neighbouring territories of Bavaria and Austria, who depended on Salzburg's salt but resented the prices charged for it. These conflicts were not grand military campaigns, but a grinding economic and occasionally military struggle over the terms of salt access, a struggle that shaped the political development of the German-speaking world in ways that historians of the Reformation tend to overlook. The phrase "not worth his salt," referring to a useless person or a bad soldier, derives from the Roman practice of paying soldiers partly in salt or in money to buy salt. But the phrase also captures something deeper. In a world where salt was money, value, and survival, the worst thing that could be said of a person was that they were not worth the salt that kept them alive. In West Africa, the salt-gold trade of the trans-Saharan routes generated repeated military conflicts over control of the northern Saharan salt mines. The Moroccan invasion of the Songhai Empire in 1591, the Saadian dynasty's astonishing military campaign that sent an army of 4,000 men across the Sahara, with Spanish muskets, was motivated primarily by desire to control the trans-Saharan trade routes and the salt mines at Tagaza. The invasion destroyed the Songhai Empire and destabilized West African commerce for a century. The salt mines changed hands, the trade routes were disrupted, and the populations of the Sahel, who had depended on reliable salt supplies for generations, paid the price. The lesson of salt wars is ultimately simple. When a population cannot survive without a commodity, whoever controls that commodity controls the population. The ancient and medieval world understood this with the directness that more complex modern economies sometimes obscure. Salt was power, and power, when threatened, reaches for the sword. The French gabelle, the royal salt tax that was one of the most hated features of the Ancien Regime, illustrates how completely a salt monopoly could become a political grievance capable of fueling revolutionary energy. The gabelle was not a single tax, but a system of regional variations so complex that it required an entire bureaucracy to administer and generated a corresponding bureaucracy of corruption to exploit. Salt prices varied by a factor of 6 or more between different regions of France, creating massive incentive for smuggling across internal borders. The gabelle was enforced by the gabellus, tax officials empowered to search homes, boats and wagons for untaxed salt and to levy heavy fines or imprisonment on smugglers. The gabellus were deeply hated, frequently assaulted and occasionally killed. The penalties for salt smuggling were severe: galley slavery for men, corporal punishment for women, forced labour for children. And yet the smuggling continued at massive scale because the price differential made it irresistible to anyone who lived near a low-tax region and could find a way to transport salt across the invisible line. By the eve of the French Revolution, the gabelle had become a symbol of everything wrong with the Ancien Regime: arbitrary, regressive, wildly unequal in its application, enforced by brutal officials against poor people trying to afford a dietary necessity, while wealthy nobles and clergy were exempt from its provisions. When the Revolutionary National Assembly abolished the gabelle in 1790, it was received as one of the most popular acts of the new government, more emotionally resonant for many ordinary French people than the more abstract constitutional reforms. The British salt tax in India operated on similarly comprehensive lines. The East India Company had developed a salt monopoly in Bengal by the late 18th century, and the Crown maintained and extended it after 1858. By Gandhi's time, the salt tax represented roughly 8% of the total British tax revenue from India, a regressive burden falling most heavily on the poorest Indians, who had the highest proportion of their income consumed by food costs including salt. The medieval European salt wars were rarely the dramatic set-piece battles that feature prominently in conventional military history. They were more commonly a form of economic warfare. The manipulation of trade routes to disadvantage competitors, the imposition of transit taxes that made rival salt sources uncompetitive, the strategic destruction of salt works during military campaigns, the fortification of key points on salt transport routes to extract tolls from passing trade. The Venetian Republic's rise to commercial dominance in the medieval Mediterranean was partly built on its early control of salt production in the lagoon environment of the northern Adriatic, and its subsequent monopolization of salt trade routes in the eastern Mediterranean. Venice understood salt not as a commodity, but as a strategic instrument, a means of binding other Italian cities to Venetian commercial networks, of creating dependencies that translated into political leverage. The Venetian salt strategy was explicit and documented. The Republic periodically offered salt at below-market prices to cities it wished to draw into its commercial orbit, accepting short-term losses in exchange for long-term dependency relationships. Cities that accepted Venetian salt on these terms found themselves gradually incorporated into Venetian trading networks, paying Venetian merchants prices for other goods, accepting Venetian commercial law in disputes. The salt was the hook, the commercial dependency was the catch. Genoa, Venice's great rival, responded with a similar strategy, using its control of the western Mediterranean salt trade to build its own commercial network. The competition between Venice and Genoa for Mediterranean salt routes was one of the structuring forces of Italian commercial history in the 13th and 14th centuries, driving innovations in commercial law, finance and ship design that had consequences far beyond the salt trade itself. The credit instruments developed by Italian merchants to manage the risks of long-distance salt trade, the bill of exchange, the Commander Partnership, the marine insurance contract, became the financial foundations of early modern European capitalism. The 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337 to 1453, had a salt dimension that is rarely discussed in conventional accounts of that conflict. The French salt-producing regions of the Atlantic coast, the Bay of Bourgneuf in particular, whose bay salt was the primary source of the Baltic preserving salt, were periodically disrupted by the conflict, with English naval activity threatening French salt ships and the French crown's ability to maintain the gabelle revenue that helped finance its war effort. Salt supply and war finance were intertwined at the highest level of both kingdoms' strategic calculations. Salt did not just move bodies across the ancient world, it moved meaning. Everywhere that salt was precious and scarce, everywhere that it was the difference between survival and starvation, between the flesh rotting and the flesh preserved, it acquired religious significance. The sacred and the practical overlapped in salt with an intimacy unusual even in the deeply sacred world of the ancient mind. In the Hebrew Bible, salt appears as a symbol of covenant, the permanent, incorruptible bond between parties. The phrase, covenant of salt, appears 3 times in the Old Testament, always in contexts of eternal, unbreakable agreement. Numbers 18:19 describes the priestly portions of the Israelite offerings as a covenant of salt forever. 2 Chronicles 13:5 invokes salt to describe the covenant between God and the house of David. Do you not know that the Lord God of Israel gave the kingship over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? The logic of the metaphor is not obscure. Salt was the great preserver, the thing that stopped decay, that maintained form and integrity against the entropy that decomposed all organic matter. A covenant of salt was a covenant that would not rot. In a world without refrigeration, without chemical preservatives, without any reliable means of preventing the organic decay that was the universal fate of flesh, salt's power to halt that process seemed almost miraculous. Of course, it acquired sacred associations. It was doing the work that only God was supposed to be able to do. The Hebrew requirement that all sacrificial offerings be salted before presentation to God, explicit in Leviticus 2:13, was not merely symbolic. It reflected the practical understanding that salt preserved the offering and prevented the decomposition that would have made it unfit for ritual use. But in religious practice, the practical and the symbolic collapse into each other. The salt that prevented physical rot also signified spiritual incorruptibility. The same substance served both purposes simultaneously. In the ancient Greek world, salt was associated with Poseidon and with the sea, the great salt water from which the gods had drawn the world. Greek hospitality rituals included the offering of bread and salt to guests, a practice that established the sacred obligation of the host to protect his guest, and the guest to respect his host. This bread and salt ritual of hospitality appears across an extraordinary range of cultures, in ancient Greece and Rome, in the Semitic traditions of the Middle East, in the Slavic cultures of Eastern Europe, in the Arabic traditions of the desert. The widespread distribution of the ritual suggests either a very old common origin or the independent development of similar symbolic thinking about salt's protective and covenanting power. The Andean civilizations of South America developed salt rituals of particular sophistication. The Inca state controlled salt production as a religious matter as well as an economic one. The great salt mines and pans of the Andes were dedicated to specific deities, and the extraction of salt required ritual preparation and ceremony. At Maras, in the sacred valley of the Incas near Cusco, a system of salt terraces fed by a single saltwater spring was managed as a community ritual resource as well as a commercial one, the proceeds shared among the community members who maintained the terraces. The Buddhist monasteries of Tibet incorporated salt into their spiritual economies in ways that made the monks key players in the salt trade. Tibetan Buddhist monks maintained the routes to the high-altitude salt lakes, managed the extraction operations, and controlled the distribution networks that brought Tibetan salt to the surrounding lowland populations. The income supported the monasteries and the teachings. The spiritual merit of supporting the monks flowed back to the lay people who used the salt trade routes the monks maintained. Religion and commerce inseparably intertwined. In Europe, Christian practice incorporated salt as a symbol of preservation and incorruption in multiple ways. Salt was used in baptismal rites from the early centuries of Christianity, placed on the tongue of the person being baptized as a sign of wisdom and preservation from corruption. Medieval church consecration rituals included the mixing of salt with water to create holy water. Exorcism rites used salt as a purifying agent. The association between salt and spiritual purity ran through European Christianity from its earliest period to the Counter-Reformation. What this remarkable cross-cultural religiosity around salt tells us is something important about the depth of human relationship with the substance. Salt was not just a trade commodity. It was material that had been woven into the deepest structures of human meaning, into ideas about life and death, preservation and decay, covenant and betrayal, the sacred and the corrupt. When we follow the salt routes, we are not just tracing commerce. We are tracing the pathways along which some of humanity's most fundamental symbolic thinking travelled. The Zoroastrian tradition of ancient Persia incorporated salt into its sacred cosmology in ways that illuminate the deep logic of salt's religious significance across cultures. In the Zoroastrian dualistic universe, where the forces of Ahura Mazda, truth and light, were in constant opposition to Ahriman, deception and darkness, salt was aligned with truth and purity because of its preserving anti-decay properties. To offer salt to a guest was to offer them protection from the deceptions of Ahriman. To violate the salt covenant, to harm someone who had eaten your salt, was to invite the forces of cosmic evil into your household. This metaphysical weight attached to salt hospitality was not unique to Zoroastrianism. The Arabic tradition of milwa nima, salt and favour, imposed a similar obligation. Once a guest had eaten your salt, you were bound to protect them even at the cost of your own life. Bedouin tribal law recognized salt hospitality as creating a legally enforceable protection, with violations punishable by communal sanction. The logic was the same across cultures. You had shared the most essential thing, the thing that preserved life. You were therefore bound to preserve life. The Shinto tradition of Japan uses salt extensively in purification rituals that continue to the present day. Salt is scattered at the entrances to Shinto shrines to purify the sacred space. Salt is placed on the bodies of the dead to purify them for the journey to the afterlife. Sumo wrestlers scatter salt into the ring before a bout to purify the sacred space of competition. The Japanese word for salt, shio, appears in dozens of ritual and purification contexts. The association between salt and purity runs deep in Japanese culture, predating the arrival of Buddhism and persisting through multiple waves of religious and cultural change. What is striking about these varied religious relationships with salt is not their differences but their similarities. Across cultures that had no contact with each other, the ancient Hebrews of the Levant, the Zoroastrians of Persia, the Shinto practitioners of Japan, the Andean civilizations of South America, salt acquired similar symbolic roles: purity, preservation, covenant, protection. The universality of these associations suggests that they derive from the universality of the underlying experience. In every culture, in every climate, salt was the thing that stood between organic matter and decay. It was impossible not to invest that power with meaning. If you control a substance that everyone needs and nobody can make themselves, you have an automatic tax base. This insight, so simple it is almost banal to state it, was understood by every sophisticated state administration in the ancient and medieval world, and it shaped the development of governmental institutions, tax systems, bureaucracies, and commercial law in ways that stretch forward to the present. China's salt monopoly system is the longest-running and most complex example in human history. Organized salt administration in China dates to at least the Western Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 771 BCE. By the Han dynasty, 206 BCE 220 CE, the state had developed a sophisticated salt licensing system in which the right to produce, transport, or sell salt required official authorization that was issued, controlled, and monetized by the imperial government. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, refined this system into the Liangshui Fa, the two-tax system, in which salt revenues played a central role in imperial finance. By the mid-Tang period, salt taxes represented roughly half of all imperial revenue. Half. The Chinese imperial government was, in significant measure, running on salt money. The armies that defended the borders, the bureaucracy that administered the empire, the canal system that moved goods across the country, all of it was funded in large part by the tax extracted at every point of the salt supply chain. The consequence of building imperial finance on salt revenues was that any disruption to the salt trade became a political crisis. The great rebellions that periodically shook the Tang and Song dynasties were frequently triggered by failures of the salt supply system, by sudden price spikes caused by crop failures or supply disruptions, by corrupt administration that diverted salt taxes into private pockets, or by the rise of smuggling networks that undercut the state monopoly and deprived the treasury of revenues it depended on. The most dramatic example is the Huangchao Rebellion of 875-884 CE, which came close to destroying the Tang dynasty entirely. Huangchao was himself a salt merchant, or more precisely a salt smuggler, operating outside the imperial licensing system in the lower Yangtze Basin. When the imperial government cracked down on the unlicensed salt trade in the 870s, Huangchao mobilized the networks of merchants, workers, and clients who had been cut off from their livelihoods, turning a commercial grievance into a political uprising that swept across half of China and briefly captured the imperial capital of Chang'an. The rebellion eventually failed. Huangchao was defeated and died in 1884. But the damage to the Tang dynasty was terminal. The dynasty collapsed in 907, and the 50 years of civil war that followed, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, was partly the consequence of the revenue crisis that the salt disruptions had produced. A salt merchant's grievance had contributed, through a chain of consequences that unfolded over decades, to the fall of one of history's great empires. India's experience with salt monopolies shaped the country's colonial history in one of the most famous political moments of the 20th century. The British Raj's salt monopoly, established by the East India Company and maintained by the Crown, made it illegal for Indians to produce or sell salt without paying the British salt tax. In a country where salt was essential to the diet and where coastal populations had produced it freely for millennia, the monopoly was experienced as a particularly galling expression of colonial control. Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March of March-April 1930. The 388-kilometre walk from Sabarmati Ashram to the Arabian Sea coast at Dandi, where Gandhi and his followers symbolically made salt from seawater in violation of the British monopoly, was deliberately designed to attack the most visible and universally felt expression of British economic control. Gandhi understood, with complete political clarity, that salt was the issue that could mobilize the broadest possible coalition of Indians across class, caste and region, because every Indian, from the untouchable labourer to the Brahmin priest, needed salt and resented paying a foreign tax for it. The Salt March broke the British monopoly, not economically but morally. Images of British police beating peaceful salt marchers with steel batons, the event at Dharasana, where 600 volunteers walked in columns toward the salt works and were beaten down without lifting a hand in defence, shifted international opinion in ways that no military campaign could have achieved. Salt, the ancient preserver, became the solvent that dissolved British moral authority in India. Within 17 years, India was independent. From the Tang dynasty's salt merchants to Gandhi's Salt March, the same logic holds. Monopolize a dietary necessity and you have power. Misuse that power and you create the conditions for your own destruction. The economics of thirst is also the economics of rebellion. The Ottoman Empire's salt administration was among the most sophisticated in the pre-industrial world. The Ottomans inherited control of some of the most productive salt sources in the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. The salt pans of the Aegean Islands, the rock salt mines of Anatolia, the brine springs of the Balkans, and organised their exploitation through a combination of state monopoly and licensed private production that extracted maximum revenue while maintaining supply reliability. The Ottoman system created a class of salt merchants, the Tuzcu, who operated under imperial license and were responsible for moving salt from production sites to distribution centres and then to retail markets. The Tuzcu were granted monopoly rights over specific routes and markets in exchange for a fixed tax payment to the imperial treasury. This arrangement gave the state a predictable revenue stream while offloading the logistical complexity of distribution to private operators who had the local knowledge and commercial relationships to manage it efficiently. The system generated significant amounts of corruption, as any monopoly system tends to do. Licensed Tuzcu who controlled key distribution routes could extract informal payments from producers and retailers alike, since alternatives were difficult or unavailable. Imperial inspectors who were supposed to prevent this became themselves targets for bribery. The records of Ottoman provincial administration are full of complaints about salt pricing irregularities, short waits, adulterated products, and the various creative methods by which everyone in the supply chain extracted additional value at the expense of the final consumer. This pattern, state monopoly, licensed distribution, systematic corruption, consumer exploitation, recurred in the salt systems of every major pre-modern empire. It was not unique to the Ottomans or the Chinese or the Romans. It was the inevitable consequence of combining a universally necessary commodity with a monopoly control structure. The monopoly was always justified by the state's need for revenue. The corruption was always the cost paid by everyone below the level of the state. The consumer paid twice, once in the official price, and again in the unofficial tribute extracted at every stage of the supply chain. The Dehydration incident on May 23, 1930 deserves more than the brief mention it typically receives in historical surveys of the Indian independence movement. On that day, 600 volunteers of the Indian National Congress, organised by Sarojini Naidu, Gandhi himself was in prison, walked in columns toward the Dehydration salt works in Gujarat, intending to peacefully enter the facility and make salt in defiance of the British monopoly. They were met by several hundred Indian policemen under the command of 6 British officers. The police carried steel-tipped bamboo batons. The volunteers carried nothing. The first column of volunteers walked forward. The police beat them to the ground. The volunteers did not raise their hands to protect themselves. The second column walked forward over the fallen bodies of the first. The police beat them down. This continued for hours. The American journalist Webb Miller witnessed the entire event and filed a report that was syndicated to newspapers across the world. His description, the methodical violence, the absolute non-resistance of the volunteers, the sounds of the batons on unprotected skulls, the blood on white cotton, the volunteers being carried away and replaced by new ones who walked forward knowing what was waiting, was read by millions of people in Europe and the United States who had previously had little emotional engagement with Indian independence. Something shifted in that reading. The British salt monopoly had suddenly revealed, with the clarity of extreme events, what it actually was: a system maintained by violence against people who needed a dietary necessity and could not afford to buy it at the price the monopoly demanded. the abstract colonial relationship between Britain and India became, in Miller's account of Dharasana, a concrete image of a boot on a neck. The salt that had once seemed like a technicality of colonial administration had become a moral symbol of overwhelming force. Ancient salt monopolists would have recognized the dynamic entirely. The salt system always contained this possibility, the possibility that the violence required to maintain it would become visible and therefore politically costly. Most of the time the violence was diffuse, embedded in the ordinary operations of enforcement, expressed in the private humiliations of tax collectors and the private desperation of people who could not afford the legal price. The genius of Gandhi's Salt March was to make that diffuse violence suddenly visible in a specific place, at a specific moment, in front of witnesses with the means to tell the world what they had seen. Cities are not permanent. This is easy to know abstractly and difficult to feel viscerally until you stand in the ruins of a place that was once a metropolis, that was once dense with people and commerce and argument and prayer and the ordinary machinery of urban life, and understand that all of it is gone, not decayed, gone. The people, the memory, the very knowledge that it existed scraped away by time until only the archaeologist's spade brings it back. The salt trade built cities, and when the salt trade shifted, when routes changed, when deposits were exhausted, when political disruption cut the supply lines, those cities died. Some survived as ruins in the desert. Others were buried entirely and are only now being rediscovered. Their stories tell us something important about the fragility of settlements built on the logistics of a single commodity. Tagaza itself is the most dramatic example from the African salt routes. At its height in the 14th and 15th centuries, Tagaza was not merely a mining camp. It was a town of several thousand people, miners, merchants, guards, cooks, water carriers, and the family members who had come or been brought along. Its houses were built of salt blocks, its mosque was built of salt, its streets were salt. Every architectural surface was the same blinding white mineral that was also its economic reason for existing. The food situation at Tagaza was always precarious. Nothing grew there. Every calorie consumed by the population had to be carried in from outside, typically from the agricultural areas of the Western Sahel, a journey of 2 to 3 weeks by camel. The price of food at Tagaza was consequently extreme, and the wages paid to salt miners, while theoretically adequate to cover those prices, were managed through a system of credit and company store obligation that kept the workforce in a state of permanent indebtedness. When the Moroccan invasion of 1591 disrupted the trans-Saharan trade routes, Tagaza went into rapid decline. The merchants who had sustained the town's economy moved to safer routes. The food supply became erratic and expensive. The population, unable to grow its own food and cut off from the trade that paid for imported food, dispersed. Within a generation, the city of salt was effectively abandoned, the salt block buildings crumbling back into the desert that had produced them. A similar pattern of rise and fall marks the cities of the Silk Road. Merv, the Great Silk Road oasis city in what is now Turkmenistan, at its height in the 12th century possibly one of the largest cities in the world, with a population estimated at between 200,000 and 700,000 people, derived much of its commercial importance from its position on the route that moved Central Asian salt east toward China and Chinese goods west toward the Mediterranean. When the Mongol forces of Tolui Khan sacked Merv in 1221 and killed a substantial portion of its population, the city never fully recovered. The trade routes that had made it great shifted, and the commercial ecosystem that had sustained its size and complexity collapsed. The Hanseatic city of Lübeck tells a different story, one of a city that successfully transitioned from salt-dependent to diversified economy and survived. Lübeck's original commercial foundation was the salt trade that enabled the Baltic herring industry. The salt came from Lüneburg, 40 kilometers to the south, where deep underground brine springs had been producing salt since at least the 10th century CE. The road from Lüneburg to Lübeck, the Old Salt Road, was one of medieval Europe's most heavily travelled commercial routes. When Baltic herring stocks collapsed in the 15th century, in what appears in retrospect to have been one of the earliest recorded commercial fishery collapses, the economic foundation of the Lüneburg-Lübeck salt trade disappeared almost overnight. Lübeck survived because it had diversified into cloth, metal goods, and other Baltic trade goods. Lüneburg, more narrowly specialised in salt production, declined significantly. Its enormous salt industry, which had once driven massive deforestation of the surrounding region as fuel for the evaporation pans, contracted, the salt pans were slowly abandoned, and the city settled into the pleasant provincial obscurity where it remains today. The lesson of the lost cities of salt is the lesson of all resource-dependent economies. The wealth that a single commodity brings is real, but it is also vulnerable. The city that rises on the back of salt, or oil, or timber, or gold, must ask, always, what happens when the commodity shifts? The ancient world had no answer to that question except decline. Some cities found another commodity, most did not. The archaeology of salt-dependent settlements reveals patterns of boom and contraction that parallel the modern experience of resource towns in mining regions. Archaeologists studying the sites of ancient salt trading centres in the Sahel have found the characteristic signature of a boom economy: rapid construction using whatever building materials were locally available, in the case of Tagaza, salt block, in the case of Jen, sun-dried mud brick. Dense population concentrated around the commercial function, minimal investment in agricultural infrastructure, because food was imported rather than grown, and a physical layout organised around the needs of the trade. When the trade shifted, the physical signature of contraction was equally clear. The commercial infrastructure was abandoned or repurposed. The population density dropped. The buildings were not maintained and began to collapse. In salt block towns like Tagaza, the very building material had the quality of returning to its origin. The salt walls dissolved slowly in the occasional rains, the structures sagging back toward the earth they had been extracted from. The desert reclaimed these places with a thoroughness that seemed almost intentional. The ghost towns of the American West, abandoned when their gold or silver deposits were exhausted, have a similar quality, a brevity of occupation that stands in stark contrast to the intensity of the period of use. The same logic applies. When the resource moves, or when it is exhausted, or when a cheaper alternative route becomes available, the settlement that existed to serve the resource loses its reason for being. Unlike agricultural towns, which have at least the possibility of adapting to different crops or different markets, a salt town or a mine town has almost no flexibility. It was built for one thing. When that thing is gone, the town is gone. The economic geographer studying ancient trade routes notices a pattern that the political historian tends to miss: the correlation between the commercial importance of a location and the vigour of its subsequent cultural memory. The great salt-trading cities, Timbuktu, Salzburg, Lübeck, Samarkand, retained significant cultural presences in the post-trade world because they had built cultural institutions, mosques, universities, churches, libraries, that outlasted the commercial conditions that funded them. Timbuktu's great manuscripts, the hundreds of thousands of scholarly texts preserved in private libraries across the city, representing one of the most significant collections of Islamic scholarship in the world, were funded ultimately by the salt and gold trade. The wealth that the trans-Saharan routes generated paid for the scholars who wrote the texts and the buildings that housed them, and the libraries that maintained them across centuries of commercial decline. The manuscripts survived when the trade did not. They are there today, damaged by Islamist attacks in 2012, but largely rescued and preserved, a direct cultural legacy of the economics of desert salt. Salzburg's extraordinary musical culture, the tradition that produced Mozart and that sustains one of Europe's most celebrated music festivals today, was built on the wealth of the Prince Archbishops, which was built on their control of the salt mines at Hallein and Berchtesgaden. The Baroque palaces and churches of Salzburg, the court musicians who developed the musical traditions that Mozart inherited, the cultural infrastructure that made the city a centre of European artistic life in the 17th and 18th centuries, all of it rested ultimately on the salt revenues that the church had been extracting from the mountains above the city for centuries. The salt built the buildings outlasted the salt monopoly, the buildings made the culture possible, the culture outlasted the economic conditions that had built the buildings. This is the long chain of historical causation that connects the salt miners of the Austrian Alps to the concert halls of modern Salzburg, and it illustrates something important about how material and cultural history interweave in ways that make their separation, for analytical purposes, ultimately artificial. Salt did not just move across the world, it transformed the world it moved through. Specifically, it transformed what people ate, when they ate it, how far food could travel, and what populations could survive in places where fresh food was unavailable for months at a time. The preservation economy that salt made possible was one of the most important technological achievements of the ancient and medieval world, and it was so pervasive, so deeply embedded in daily life, that it was largely invisible to the people who depended on it. Consider the cod. The Atlantic codfish, Gadus morhua, is one of the most nutritionally dense foods available in the pre-modern world. High in protein, relatively high in fat, large and easy to catch in the enormous shoals that once filled the North Atlantic. But fresh cod, like all fish, deteriorates rapidly. Without preservation, a cod caught in the Grand Banks off Newfoundland or the fishing grounds off Iceland cannot be transported to the markets of interior Europe, cannot even make the journey to port in many cases. Salt cod, bacalhau, as the Portuguese call it, changed that calculation entirely. Salt-dried cod could survive for months or years without refrigeration. It could be transported thousands of kilometers by ship and then overland by cart. It could feed the monasteries of inland France and the armies of Mediterranean Spain and the urban poor of London and Lisbon. It became a dietary staple of the entire Atlantic world, and it did so because salt made it possible. The economic consequences of salt preservation were profound. The Baltic herring industry, which at its height processed millions of fish per year in the Great Autumn catches off the Swedish and Danish coasts, was essentially an exercise in turning a wild resource into a durable, transportable commodity through the application of salt. The herring themselves were worthless without the salt to preserve them. The salt was worthless without the herring to be preserved. The two together created one of the most important food supply systems in medieval European history. For the populations of northern Europe, salted herring was not a luxury. It was a survival food. The Church's requirement for fasting from meat on Fridays and during Lent potentially 150 days per year, created an enormous market for preserved fish as a meat substitute, a market that the Baltic herring industry was specifically organised to supply. The intersection of religious practice, dietary restriction, and salt preservation technology produced a commercial system that fed tens of millions of people and enriched the cities that managed it. The meat preservation side of the salt economy was equally important, especially at the agricultural margins of Europe, where livestock raising was the primary food system. The autumn slaughter, the killing of animals that could not be fed through the winter on depleted pasture, was one of the most important events in the agricultural calendar of medieval Europe, and the success of the winter food supply depended entirely on how well that meat could be preserved. A pig salted correctly in November could provide edible meat through the following summer. A pig salted incorrectly, too little salt, poor penetration, inadequate drainage of the brine, would develop putrefaction within weeks, wasting the animal and potentially sickening the family that ate it. The knowledge of how to salt meat correctly was practical, crucial, transmitted through families across generations, and entirely dependent on having access to sufficient quantities of salt at the right time of year. The great salt fairs of medieval Europe, the Champagne fairs in France, the September fair at Bruges, the autumn markets of the Hansa cities, were timed in part to coincide with the pre-slaughter salt buying season. Farmers who needed salt for their November killing had to buy it in October, which is why the autumn fairs were so critical and so well attended. The rhythm of the agricultural year was set in significant measure by the rhythm of the salt supply. This is the deepest way in which salt shaped civilization, not through the grand narratives of empire and war, but through the humble, essential, utterly unremarkable daily dependency of people trying to feed their families. The farmer buying salt at the autumn fair, the fishwife packing herring into brine, the monastery cook measuring out the preserving dose for the winter's meat. These people were the actual base of the salt economy, the foundation on which all the trade routes and empires and monopolies rested. Their individual names are lost, their choices, multiplied across hundreds of generations, shaped the world. The preservation revolution that salt made possible had profound demographic consequences. Populations that had reliable access to preserved food, particularly preserved protein in the form of salted fish and meat, could survive winters, famines, and supply disruptions that would otherwise have caused mass mortality. The expansion of northern European populations in the medieval period was partly enabled by the Baltic herring industry, which provided a reliable, affordable, transported protein source to inland populations throughout the year. The relationship between salt, preserved food, and demographic expansion can be traced in the archaeological record through the distribution of fish bones in inland medieval settlements. In settlements with good access to the salt trade network, connected to the Hanseatic trade routes or the salt roads of Central Europe, fish bones, particularly herring and cod, appear regularly in the food waste deposits. In settlements without such access, the diet was more narrowly local, more vulnerable to seasonal variation, and the demographic data, where we have it, suggests lower life expectancy and higher infant mortality. The monastic communities of medieval Europe were particularly sophisticated users of the preservation economy. Because their dietary rules, the Church's restrictions on meat consumption during fasting periods, the Benedictine emphasis on self-sufficiency in food production, required them to develop efficient salt preservation systems. Monastic salt stores were substantial, managed with the same precision that monasteries applied to their libraries and vineyards. The records of large medieval monasteries often include detailed accounts of salt purchases, storage conditions, and the quantities used for different preservation purposes. Those records, surviving in monastery archives where they were preserved by the same institutional continuity that preserved the manuscripts, give us some of our most detailed evidence for the salt economies of medieval Europe. A 12th century account from the Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy records the annual salt requirement for preserving the monastery's winter food supply, the price paid to the salt merchant who delivered it, the conditions of storage in the monastery's salt cellar, and the quantities used month by month through the winter. It is, in its careful quantification of a dietary necessity, one of the most illuminating economic documents of the medieval world. The medieval salt market was not a simple retail operation. It was a sophisticated commercial institution with its own rules, measurements, quality standards, and credit practices. Salt came in many grades, not by choice but by the nature of different production methods and sources. Bay salt from the Atlantic, produced by solar evaporation of seawater, was coarse and grey and excellent for fish preservation, but too mineral-tasting for direct culinary use. Rock salt from Central European mines was purer but harder to distribute in consistent particle sizes. Brine spring salt, boiled and crystallized, could be produced in consistently fine crystals, ideal for table use but required enormous fuel input. The different grades served different markets and commanded different prices. The fish curers of the Baltic needed the cheap coarse bay salt by the barrel load. Price per unit mattered more than purity. The noble household's table wanted fine white salt that could be served from an elegant salt cellar and represented the family's wealth through its refinement. The butcher's shop needed a reliable middle grade that would penetrate meat quickly and evenly without imparting off flavours. The same mineral commodity served radically different purposes at different price points through a sophisticated distribution system that directed each grade to its most efficient use. The salt cellar, the ornate container placed at the centre of a noble dining table, is one of the most revealing artefacts of the medieval social hierarchy of salt. In a great lord's hall, the salt cellar was placed at a specific point on the table. Above or below it marked your social position. To sit above the salt meant you were a person of consequence, dining near the lord and his family. To sit below the salt meant you were of lesser rank, further from the centre of power, marked by the spatial relationship to this mineral that everyone needed but not everyone could afford, in its most refined and ceremonially presented form. The great salt cellars of the medieval and Renaissance nobility were masterworks of goldsmithing, elaborate sculptural objects that served a ceremonial function far beyond their practical one. The most famous surviving example, Benvenuto Cellini's golden salt cellar made for Francis III of France in 1543, now in Vienna's Kunsthistorisches Museum, depicts Neptune and Earth facing each other across a small container for salt and pepper, surrounded by allegorical figures of extraordinary craft and detail. It is one of the great works of Renaissance goldsmithing, and it is, at its functional core, a salt shaker. The gap between those two descriptions is a measure of how completely salt had been invested with symbolic and social significance by the culture that produced it. The trans-Saharan camel caravans did not end in a single moment. They declined, slowly at first and then rapidly, over the course of the 20th century. The truck arrived in the Sahara in the 1920s and 1930s, following the paved roads that colonial administrations were extending across the desert. At first, trucks and caravans coexisted. The trucks were unreliable, prone to breakdown in the sand, dependent on spare parts that were often weeks away. The camel required no spare parts, but the trajectory was clear. By the 1960s and 1970s, the great commercial caravans of the trans-Saharan routes had largely ceased. A few traditional caravan routes persisted as cultural practice or as transport for communities in areas the truck roads had not yet reached. The annual Azalai caravan, the traditional salt caravan from the wells of Taudeni, the successor site to medieval Tagaza, to the markets of Timbuktu, continued operating into the 21st century, one of the last functioning examples of a transport system that had once been the circulatory network of a continent. In the Austrian Alps, the Hallstatt mine that has been operating for more than 3,000 years is still operating. It is the oldest continuously active salt mine in the world. Modern miners use electric machinery and automated extraction systems in the same mountain that Bronze Age workers entered by torchlight with wooden-handled iron picks. The continuity is not symbolic. It is commercial. The salt is still there. It is still valuable. The work continues. The Silk Road salt routes of Central Asia were disrupted at various points by Mongol conquest, Ottoman expansion, and the great shift of maritime trade routes in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Portuguese opening of the sea route to India around Africa in 1498, enabled by technological innovations in ship design and navigation, effectively removed the economic foundation from much of the overland Silk Road by providing a faster, cheaper alternative for the most valuable commodities. Salt was always too heavy and too low value per weight to justify long sea voyages, but as the silk and spice trade shifted to the sea lanes, the caravanserai network that had also carried salt fell into reduced use, and with it the communities that had served the caravan trade. The Roman Via Salaria survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire as a local road, its imperial maintenance abandoned, its paving stones gradually cracked and displaced by tree roots and frost and the absence of repair. Medieval travellers used it. Renaissance merchants used it. Modern drivers use a road largely following its alignment. But the salt monopoly that had given it its name and its economic purpose was gone. The state apparatus that had made it work, the salt censors, the distribution networks, the price controls and welfare subsidies, dissolved with the empire that had created it. Salt itself, as a commercial commodity, was democratized by industrialization. The Solvay process, developed in the 1860s, allowed salt to be manufactured in enormous quantities from brine wells at costs far below the ancient premium for mined or evaporated salt. Refrigeration, developed commercially in the second half of the 19th century, removed the necessity of salt preservation for most food categories. The twin technologies of industrial salt production and mechanical refrigeration dismantled within 2 generations the economic foundations of the salt trade that had organized human commerce for 5,000 years. Salt is now so cheap it is essentially free. The container of table salt on your kitchen shelf costs less, in inflation-adjusted terms, than any equivalent quantity of salt in human history. The routes that moved it, the Roman roads, the Saharan tracks, the Silk Road passes, are monuments or tourist attractions or modern highways. The men who walked those routes are dust, and yet the salt routes shape the world we live in. The cities that salt built, Timbuktu, Lübeck, Salzburg, Samarkand, are still there, changed beyond recognition but continuous with their origins. The legal systems that salt monopolies created, the principles of state control over essential commodities, the rights of merchants against arbitrary taxation, the concept of regulated trade, persist in the structure of modern commercial law. The road alignments that salt caravans established, the Via Salaria, the Saharan tracks, the Silk Road corridors, became the alignments of modern roads, railways, trade routes. We are, in the most literal sense, still walking the paths that salt made. The Azalai caravan that still operates today in Mali represents something unusual in the modern world, a functioning survival of a pre-industrial logistics system in its original form. The men who walk from the wells of Tawa North to the salt deposits of Taudeni and back are not reenactors or cultural heritage performers. They are commercial operators, making a living in the same way that men made a living on this route 700 years ago, using the same technology, the dromedary camel, and the same organizational principles. The caravan hierarchy, the water discipline, the navigational knowledge passed from masters to apprentices. They persist because, in the specific context of the Malian Sahara in the early 21st century, the camel caravan is still economically competitive for moving bulk goods across the deep desert, where road infrastructure is minimal and truck breakdowns are common and expensive. The caravan does not need a mechanic, spare parts, or fuel depots. It needs water, animal health, and knowledge, all of which the caravanners have. For as long as the roads remain bad, and the trucks remain unreliable, and the camel remains healthy, the Azalai will continue. But the Azalai caravanners know they are the end of something. The road is coming. The trucks are improving. The salt from Taudeni competes with cheaper industrial salt from the coast, which is trucked in on increasingly reliable roads. The economic margins are thin and getting thinner. The young men of the desert communities are moving to cities rather than apprenticing to caravan masters. The knowledge, the internalized geography, the camel expertise, the water discipline, is not being transmitted at the rate at which it is being lost. When the Azalai ends, when the last commercial camel caravan crosses the Sahara to the salt flat of Taudeni and returns with its load, something very old will stop. Not just an economic practice, but a form of human knowledge and human endurance that has no equivalent in the modern world. The desert will still be there, the salt will still be there, but the men who knew how to cross to it and return will be gone, and the knowledge will be gone with them. This is not nostalgia. The caravanners themselves are largely not nostalgic. They work hard and live difficult lives, and most of them would happily take a reliable truck over a camel if the roads allowed. The loss is not of a romantic way of life, but of a specific, irreplaceable, and extraordinarily sophisticated body of knowledge about how human beings can move through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Once lost, it cannot be reconstructed from books, because much of it was never in books. The man from our cold open made it. The 48 blocks of salt he walked 11 weeks to deliver are now on a cloth in the Jen market, and merchants are pressing forward to negotiate their price. He is not thinking about history. He's not thinking about the Silk Road or the Via Salaria or the great chain of commercial connections that link his small transaction to the largest economic structures of the medieval world. He is thinking about water, and about the price per block, and about whether the camel can walk as far as Segu before needing to rest for a day. He is thinking about his family in Timbuktu and the share of the profits they need to cover the debts from the last crossing, when 2 camels died and the load had to be divided among already burdened animals and the profit margin was crushed. He is living inside logistics, inside the brutal arithmetic of distance and weight and price, inside the ancient system that we've been tracing across continents and centuries, the system that is, from the inside, not a system at all, but simply the conditions of a human life. as immediate and physical and unromantic as the salt crystals under his fingernails and the cracked skin on his lips. The history of ancient trade routes is often told at the level of empires and commodities, of dynasties and volumes and the broad sweep of commercial forces. This is true and useful, but it misses the scale at which all of this actually happened, at the scale of the individual body, moving through specific terrain, making specific choices about when to stop and when to push on, what to carry and what to leave behind, who to trust and who to watch. Every gram of salt that moved along these routes passed through hands exactly like his. Cracked hands, sunburned hands, hands that had learned through long practice exactly how to pack a load so it would not shift on a camel's back through a long day's walk. Hands that had touched the salt and then touched their children's faces and that eventually stopped touching anything. We do not know his name. We will not know his name. He is the ghost at the base of every grand historical account, the worker, the labourer, the man who actually moved the thing that made the empires possible. History rarely records his kind in detail. History prefers to look at what he carried rather than the cost of his carrying it. But we have tried, in this documentary, to look at him, to follow the roots at ground level, at the level of the body, at the level of the salt blocks in the saddlebag, and the cracked lips and the dying camels, and the careful rationing of water at the approach to a well that might be dry. The price of salt was never just a number in a merchant's ledger. It was a man's body. It was the miles he walked. It was the risk he carried alongside the commodity. It was the specific, irreplaceable fact of his presence in a specific place, in a specific hour of history, doing the physical work that made civilization possible. The salt routes are gone now. The caravans have mostly ended. The great monopolies have dissolved. The commodity itself has been democratized into near worthlessness. But the roots are still there, beneath the tarmac and the sand. And the logic that built them, the logic of necessity, of scarcity, of the human body's irrefutable demand, is still there too. We're not so far from the man in the gen market. We're not so far from the cracked lips and the arithmetic of weight and distance and price. We have changed the commodity and the transportation method. We have not changed the hunger. The price of salt was always the price of survival, and someone always had to pay it. The world produces roughly 300 million tons of salt per year. The price per ton in international commodity markets varies between 30 and 60 US dollars, cheap enough that most people never think about it as a meaningful expense. The extraordinary premium that salt commanded in the ancient and medieval world, the premium that justified crossing the Sahara with a camel caravan, that built the cities of Timbuktu and Salzburg and Lübeck, that financed empires and caused wars, is gone. The commodity has been democratized beyond anything its ancient traders would recognize. And yet the chemistry has not changed. The sodium chloride that crystallizes in modern industrial evaporation pans is identical to the sodium chloride that Bronze Age miners chiseled out of the Hallstatt mountain. The human body's requirement for it is unchanged. The food preservation properties that made it so valuable in a world without refrigeration are still real, still used. In the artisanal cheese and cured meat industries, in food processing, in chemical manufacturing, in dozens of industrial applications that the ancient salt traders would not have imagined. What has changed is the geography of value. Salt is no longer valuable where it is produced and precious where it is consumed. It is cheap everywhere. The logistics that moved it, The roots that were the arteries of the ancient commercial world are no longer necessary for salt, though they have been repurposed for other flows of material. The roads that salt built now carry everything else. The ports that salt monopolies financed now handle container shipping. The commercial relationships that salt trade established between North Africa and Europe, between China and Central Asia, between the Baltic and the Atlantic, persist in the trade networks of the modern world, carrying different goods but following the same geographic logic that salt first established. The man in the gen market, our man, the nameless caravanier with the cracked lips and the 48 salt blocks and the trembling camel, is a figure from a world that no longer exists. But he is also a figure from a world that built ours. The routes he walked are still roads. The market where he sold his salt is still a market. The city of Jenny is still there, its great mud brick mosque still standing, its weekly market still drawing traders from across the region. The salt trade that made Jen possible has changed beyond recognition, but the impulse that drove it, the human imperative to move what exists where it does not exist, to trade what you have for what you need, to endure extraordinary hardship in service of the ordinary necessity of life. That impulse has not changed at all. It is as old as the species. It will outlast us. The price of salt was always this, that someone had to care enough about survival, their own, their families, their trading partners, their civilizations, to walk into the desert and bring something back. Not for glory, not for history, for the specific, irreplaceable, utterly ordinary fact of staying alive in a world that required constant effort to remain livable. That effort is the story. That effort is always the story. The commodity changes. The routes change. The empires that tax the routes change. But the effort, the body moving through difficulty toward the thing that is needed, never changes. It is the oldest human story. It is the story that made us.